Disclaimer: the views expressed on this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek are solely the opinions of the host and the guest. The content of the conversation is not reflective of the institutions or establishments mentioned therein. Take all these opinions with a pinch of salt and a dash of lime if needed. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whenever you're watching or listening, and welcome to this episode of Perspective Platoon with Prateek. In this episode, I'm going to be speaking about free speech, censorship, is free speech really free, and much more. So stay tuned. All right. So, for starters, for those of you watching this on video, it probably doesn't matter to you as much if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. The camera angle is going to look a little weird because my camera issues seem to be going from bad to worse. However, we're going to truck along and figure it out. And for now, I'm going to be using my um, laptop's webcam at an elevated platform so that I can look at it on eye level and so that it doesn't look like I'm looking down. Anyway, that's the admin out of the way. Not really admin, but just, I don't know, um, a bit of a pointer, I guess, to acknowledge the fact that this is going to look a little weird, a little different. But you still get to hear this beautiful voice. Well, uh, to each their own. To each their own about what voice is beautiful or not. But anyway, before I go into different tangents about voices, let's get into the main topic of conversation. Why am I choosing to talk about censorship, free speech, and all that sort of stuff? Well, some of it is kind of connected to the Oscars and Will Smith slapping Chris Rock. Some of it is also connected to the recent sort of environment associated with social media platforms and the sort of control of content in terms of what goes out and what doesn't, and what's banned and what's shadow banned, and so on and so forth. To my knowledge, this is probably more, or this has probably been more prevalent for the past 5-ish years, and it's become a lot louder in that period, wherein you notice people being called to be cancelled for certain things that they say, or you also notice certain instances where platforms pull certain videos or podcasts for certain things being said, and so on and so forth. Before I get into that, I do want to sort of mention this um, interesting point that I had heard on the Charlie and Ben podcast. And this is probably something I heard 2 years back or so, which is that distinction between a platform and a publisher. For those of you who are unaware, a platform is mainly a space where people can upload whatever they want to with little to no consequences, I suppose, is one way of putting it. Whereas a publisher is more so a platform or a space where there is an entity that controls what goes out and what doesn't. Most platforms, to my knowledge, started out as that, as platforms where you could put most things out there without facing major consequences. However, today you can see that a lot of these platforms have morphed into publishers to where they control certain things that go out and that are like housed on their platform, so to speak. Am I here to say that one is right and one is wrong? Not at all. This is not the goal of this conversation. This conversation, or the goal of this conversation, I should say, is just for me to share my opinions about some of these things and help to create a bit of a safe space, excuse me, to where we can talk about these things um, and have a healthy discussion a discussion, excuse me, about our opinions when it comes to free speech, censorship, the consequences, and so on. So now that I've sort of distinguished what a platform is and what a publisher is, I just want to get into the sort of social media aspect of free speech and censorship. And then we'll go into probably more of a broader perspective in terms of society and free speech, etc. For starters, I don't know why I'm taking such a long pause. There's like multiple thoughts, or well, I know why I'm taking a long pause. There's like multiple thoughts shooting at me. I don't know why. I don't want to fill it with too much silence, but I'd rather be silent than be umming and eyeing for the next half hour. But anyway, to get into that conversation topic of censorship on platforms and so on, if I'm not mistaken, these platforms do hold the right to pull what they want to pull out and allow certain things to stay on their platform. To my knowledge, it is probably part of the terms and conditions that most of us don't read and just accept for the heck of it because we don't want to sit there and read for about 2 hours. But the fact that these are private companies, they probably have more control over the things that they allow on their platforms. But just to sort of look at this more abstractly, I guess a question that has been popping up in my mind for a little while now is the line that is drawn to determine what is right and what is not to go out on a certain platform. I can understand a line being drawn for certain things that shouldn't be out there. 100%. Certain graphic content is probably better to be out than in the sort of space of a certain platform for their own reasons and also for those who are watching. However, there's certain questions that do pop up when these lines are drawn on financial motives or motives of wanting to keep a certain narrative ahead of the multiple other narratives that might be fostering in the background. It becomes slightly questionable or slightly icky, for the lack of a better word, when a multi-billion dollar company funds a platform to minimize certain things that are said or to possibly skew the conversations that are being had to where it's a very one-sided argument about a certain topic of conversation rather than a multifaceted argument. And you can see this out there in the world. I don't need to mention specific examples, um, but it's just a question that I believe is worth asking. Who decides to draw this line? And why is it that they have the right to draw the line? Now, the terms and conditions will suggest that they have the right to draw the line, as I mentioned at the start of this um, bit. But I believe that it does become a little problematic when these platforms might seem as a front for where people can share whatever they want. In good faith, of course. I'm going to put that as a caveat in good faith. But then, because it doesn't fit the certain narrative that is sponsoring something, they put the kibosh on it. Your video is either pulled or your channel gets certain strikes and etc. Excuse me, etc. etc. It does make it a little problematic because to the beholder, it can definitely seem like this is a place where they can have an open conversation about things. But 2 days later, they see that their video is being pulled. A great example of this. I don't want to ponder too much on this specific point because it's a rabbit hole of its own, but I would like to mention it as an example. Um, and that is the Dark Horse podcast, which is hosted by a former biology professor, if I'm not mistaken, in Bret Weinstein. He and his wife, Heather, I forget her last name, I believe it's Hang, um, have mentioned instances where their videos have been pulled for them having certain conversations related to the pandemic. I found out more so about this through the Joe Rogan experience and them coming on there and talking about it. I personally haven't gone and watched these videos, so there is that full disclaimer of me not being fully aware of the content of those videos. But to my knowledge of what they said on the Joe Rogan experience, because I did listen to those episodes, it was certain scientific debates based off of certain medications being minimized, the volume being turned down on those discussions, if you will. Now, if you want to look at it from a perspective of experimentation, science, and exploration and curiosity, you do have to wonder, why is it that some things are allowed and some things aren't? Is it because these groups that are purporting a certain um I don't want to call it an agenda because it's not, but a certain side, let's say, that doesn't necessarily fit the larger narrative that these platforms do want to push out there? Or is it because they're actually sharing something that could be dangerous? Now, I totally understand that there are some things that shouldn't be on the internet, while some things should come with certain caveats or disclaimers that encourages people to do their research and to find out what works best for them and so on and so forth. Because blindly believing in some of these things can also be harmful for us as human beings. Certain things that might be proposed as medications for some other things or for some diagnoses or diseases might not actually work. So please do your due diligence. And my point with that being, I'm okay in some sense with platforms adding those caveats through like disclaimers or info tags because Spotify does this, and I've noticed and I've noticed them do this on some of my episodes or some of the episodes of the podcast as well, where I've had guests and I've spoken about the pandemic and so on. There is a tag on the top that says more about COVID 19. Now, I totally understand why that is there, and I don't necessarily have a huge problem with that. My problem mainly arises when some of these videos are taken off of platforms. So, going back to what I was talking about, there was a certain discussion that Bret Weinstein and his wife Heather were having, or they were having with a certain guest that was pulled from YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. I don't know. Again, like going back to my initial question, who decides to draw this line? And what are the motivations behind these lines being drawn? That is the question that I have. Is it fully in good faith? Is it in the financial interest for these companies? Is it actually in the interest of the people and society at large? That's a big question mark for me still, personally. Because I personally am a person that leans more on the side of personal accountability and being responsible for the decisions that I make. But I can also see the side to where, you want to make sure that you're not putting things out there that can seriously, like legitimately harm people. I can see the side. And not everybody's acting in their financial interests, but they're more so acting in good faith and for a noble cause. However, some questions do need to be asked about the decisions being made and why certain things are pulled and why certain things are not. In terms of us being able to share our opinions and freely share our opinions, there probably is more of a clouded sort of perspective of the law maybe carrying into a private platform. The public law may purport that speech is free, whereas there might be certain nuances that we as people are unaware of when it comes to speech on certain platforms, as again I mentioned earlier. But for me, again, like I am harping on the same point because it's something that I wonder almost every day. Because I do have certain thoughts where I wonder if I want to talk about a certain thing, but then I also wonder if that will come with consequences to where this channel is fully shut down. Um, am I overthinking it? Probably am. I'm not gonna disregard that fact. I probably am overthinking um, in some instances, but it's a question I believe that's worth asking. It's a question that we probably need to think about when we attack certain schools of thought, because to some extent, not to an entire extent, but to some extent, there is a level of exploration and understanding that occurs through having conversations, through having proper conversations with people of opposing sides and multiple different sides. We can find ways to see the different perspective and understand where they're coming from and understand certain nuances that might add to that conversation point and etc. But the cynic in me does feel like as a society we are afraid of having some of these conversations, that we might be running away from them. Now again, this is just my viewpoint. I might be very wrong about this, and maybe there are conversations out there, but I just don't see them. I acknowledge that. But from where I stand today, on the 6th of April, 2022, I do believe that to some extent we're afraid of confrontation and conversation, which is something that we as humans probably need to internally fix. And I think this gels nicely into my next talking point for this episode, which is about free speech from a macro sense. I know this is very muddled, but I w- th- I'm using this episode more so to make people possibly ask themselves some questions. So it is going to seem quite muddled, and of course, as I've mentioned, these are just opinions. Please do your due diligence to find out what is the best for you, be it through be it when it comes to certain things that affect you directly, or like through food and medicine and blah blah blah. There's a lot of sources out there that you can look at in terms of finding out what will work the best. Now, that caveat being mentioned, let's get into the topic of free speech from a from a macroscopic sense. Now we saw with the whole Will Smith incident that even though Chris Rock had the freedom to say that joke that he made, it did not necessarily free him from Will Smith walking upstage and slapping him. Now, I don't want to make this again about Will Smith and Chris Rock. That's old news at this point, just based off of how fast the news churns. one story out after another. But I'm just using that as an example because it's quite a recent one. So, in that example, you sort of tend to have to look and ask, does freedom of speech guarantee you freedom from the consequences of you saying a certain thing? I personally don't think so. Freedom of speech, I'm sorry, again, like last week, I'm quite passionate, so I'm shaking things around me. Anyway, um, freedom of speech to some extent doesn't necessarily guarantee freedom of consequences. Is that a right thing or a wrong thing? Wrong thing? Is that the right or wrong thing? Again, I have no clue. This is just a random guy on the internet talking out of his ass about his opinions. Excuse me. But it's something worth thinking about because in this case, it becomes the line that is drawn becomes very arbitrary. The line in this situation of Will Smith and Chris Rock was drawn by Will Smith. The line in some other cases is drawn by those offended. I've shared this on Twitter through or maybe even on Instagram about my opinions on offense and being offended and blah blah. I feel like I've been using the phrase blah 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 quite often lately, just as filler words. So I apologize. I will work on myself to avoid using such filler words. Um, but going back to what I was saying, who draws the line? I might say something that might offend you. My intention is not necessarily to offend you, but I just want to have a conversation. Now, there is another caveat. I feel like a lot of the times I add caveats to things when I shouldn't, but anyway, I do feel like it's important to mention it. Good intentions don't always need to result out in good actions. They can always lead to bad things as well. Because then again, that subjectivity of good and bad is very personal to us as human beings. And what might be good for you might be bad for somebody else. So there is that element of subjectivity there, and I acknowledge that the presence of that element. With that being said, are most people on the internet trying to offend you? Excluding the trolls. Like, let's get the trolls out of the way. Don't worry about those. You know, that's not something that I'm necessarily looking at, but I'm just looking at a random stranger saying something that you don't like. What is that statement that that person makes affecting? How is it harming those that are on the receiving end of these statements? I think those are some questions that also need to be asked before we sort of jump on certain bandwagons of canceling certain people or shadow banning and blah, 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 blah. I think it's a question worth asking because we all might be in that position one day just because of how connected we are to our social profiles through social media apps that we might get blocked or banned for saying certain things that you meant with good faith. Now, again, maybe there is more for me to learn from this aspect, which through having this conversation, maybe someone can point out. which is why I think it's healthy to have this conversation. Um, but yeah, anyway, before I go into another rabbit hole, it's worth asking that question of who determines that. We live in a world where it's very easy to get offended. In some cases, I understand why that happens. In some others, I have more questions. The reason I say that is because a lot of the times, and I mean, I've been there too. I have been there myself where I've read a tweet and I've felt like that tweet was speaking to me and I was being offended and it was the end of the world. And no, it's that person who tweeted that thing probably doesn't even know that a person looking like me exists. So, in that case, is it right to ban that person? Or do things that might affect their careers, affect their lives? I don't know. It's hard to. Saying I don't know is not sexy for the internet. You need to be on one side or the other. You need to take a stand on something. But I just feel like with life in general, there's a lot of things that we don't know. We just have no clue about certain things. And this is one of those things. I understand, and mostly I stand on the aisle that suggests that freedom of speech doesn't necessarily guarantee you the freedom from its consequences. But are we taking it too far when it comes to sort of putting these messages out there that lead to consequences that are damaging? Instead of just trying to correct, are we trying to overcorrect some of these things? Is it just a mere overreaction? Again, this episode is me just asking a lot of questions about censorship and free speech and consequences and etc. If you are listening to this, I would love for you to share your opinion through Instagram. If you don't want to put your opinion out there publicly, excuse me, I respect that. Um, if you feel like it might affect you, I totally understand. You don't need to necessarily put it in the comments below. You can just DM me on Instagram or DM me on Twitter. I would be more than happy to have a conversation through the chats with you. But I would love to learn more about this. Like, where is the line drawn? If there is anything that you can take away from this episode, it is one, where is this line drawn? Number two, who determines where this line is drawn? And number three, do we even know anything? With that being said, I'm going to call it good for today. These were just some of my opinions on, as I said, free speech, censorship, and consequences, and etc. Um, I would love to create a space where we can have these conversations and talk about it. Even if we feel like our opinions might not necessarily conform with society, so to speak, or certain sections of society, we should be able to have these conversations, because through having these conversations, we can eliminate those doubts that probably creep up in our mind. We can eliminate certain confusions that we might have. We can go in with an open mind and understand the different sides that exist that we probably weren't privy to before having those conversations. So at the end of the day, maybe the fourth thing that you should take away from this episode is embrace conversation. Embrace hard conversations. As much as they might feel like they're hitting your ego, they're like just smashing your subconscious and smashing your own personal beliefs. For those of you listening, I'm just pounding my fist into my palm. Um, Apologies if you're hearing some weird clapping. But we need to learn to embrace these conversations and have them. And I hope that as a society we walk towards a time where we're not as scared of having these conversations. And they don't need to be on the internet. They can always be in private with people that you have disagreements with. But because we live in an age where we're hyper connected to social media, some of these do have to sort of spill into this domain we call the internet. So, yeah, with that being said, thank you so much for listening or watching. I appreciate you being a part of all of this and just listening to me ramble for about half an hour about my thoughts, where I just spew the thoughts out of my brain. Because, I mean, even though I say that I'm talking out of my ass doesn't have a brain, so I don't know how that would work. But anyway, that is me just trying to be a little more funny, but I don't know if that was really a joke. And before I start rambling on even more, thank you once again. Take care, stay safe, and don't forget to keep your mind open to different perspectives. Because you never know, random relatability might just be around the corner.